So let's discuss more about Chicago. It was, from the time you were 12 until late 1989. I'd like to speak to you more about Chicago.
Yes.
About, we discussed Chicago already, but I'd like to speak to you again, and really focus on, what you recollect, the best of your recollection.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Regarding the
Yeah.
workings of the trafficking. Like what
Okay. And
your
I.
experience was of what you saw, of individuals coming and going, of more about what you
Okay.
yourself experienced of assault, what you
Okay.
remember of
Yes.
individuals.
More detail
Yeah.
of exactly
What
what
you're
took place and what
comfortable.
I experienced. And at first it was extremely difficult for me to go into detail about sexual encounters that I had had when I was 12, 13, 14. And it was just very difficult for me to talk about it. Because as a man now, it's a little embarrassing for me to talk about men doing things to me, even though I'm gay.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because it happened to me at such a young age, and I've talked to other male victims that were connected to friends of Leslie Wexner's, and they feel the same way, and a lot of them are straight and they're married, they have kids, so it's difficult for them too to talk about their experiences. As far as everything that I remember and just what I've witnessed, I mean, I just remember the amount of people. I mean, from when this happened to me at the age of 12, when I first came in contact with the entire group, and even the term trafficking, I mean, I don't think it even existed back then. But yet, what I experienced was trafficking. I was always taught to think about it as being, okay, we're going to visit Leslie's friend. We are going to visit Alan's friends. So, because I was 12, 13, 14 years old at the time, I guess it's difficult for me to call it trafficking, but yet it was trafficking. And
Yeah.
for years, I mean, I would say up until the point of Maria explaining to me what trafficking involves, I truly didn't realize that what was going on was trafficking when I was 12, 13, 14. But even now, when I look at the entire Epstein case and I look at what Ghislaine did and what I believe she's guilty of, I realized that the operation that took place when I was young almost was exactly the same operation that took place with Maria, Virginia, and all the Epstein victims or survivors.
I've spoken. I've to add to that contextually. I've spoken to victims that were trafficked, even during like 2000s, early 2020s, and one of the victims I spoke to, her experience is similar to Sasha's experience during the earlier 1980s, late 1970s, and to the degree that, and a lot of the victims I've spoken to is like by the late 70s, the mechanisms with which the ring and associated rings were operating were already in place. The luring techniques, the kidnapping techniques, the grooming techniques, the drugging techniques, the attempts to tamper with memory, and so on. And that seems to have been well greased already by the 70s, because the experiences Sasha experienced were similar to victims that I've spoken to that were trafficked during different decades, even until
Yes.
recently.
Yes, you're correct, because everything that I experienced like from 79, 80, 81, 82 is exactly what Maria and Virginia explained to me that Jeffrey was doing with the girls. And what's interesting is that it's as if Leslie Wexner trained Jeffrey Epstein in how to do all of this. And I remember there was an email where Leslie is warning Jeffrey that came out in the Epstein files. And Leslie Wexner is warning Jeffrey as if he had experienced everything in the past, which he did in the 80s in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's as if he's letting Jeffrey know that you got yourself into this and I had already warned you. And the email sounded as if Leslie had experienced the same in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that Sasha's recollections of Epstein and of Ghislaine were of more sort of, Epstein was more sort of marginal in regards to the ring's operations during the 80s, but was involved. And Ghislaine, his more prominent memory is that his adoptive mother, Murray Lynn, experienced difficulties with pronunciation. I also sometimes experience difficulties with pronunciation. Anyway, that was his prominent memory, is that his adopted parents thought that Ghislaine was creepier than almost anyone else they'd met within the ring, and there was concerns over pronunciation during the 1980s.
Yes. And I have heard that from several Epstein victims regarding Ghislaine.
Yeah.
And there was something else that was interesting. As far as pilots, you had mentioned that Sasha's father was a pilot, was it?
Yes.
And what I remember in Chicago, the entire group, they were always hiring and firing pilots. Why they were hiring and firing pilots so often, when I look back on it, I have no idea. I mean, how many pilots are out there that had knowledge of what was going on? Because for some reason, they would always joke around as far as wanting white boys under 15 from Iowa and Nebraska, which I always thought was strange. But then Mrs. Florsheim's hairdresser, Lance Durfee, was from Iowa, and he would always say, oh, they want those little farm boys, innocent farm boys. And I remember Lance would fly, sometimes commercial and sometimes in a private plane, flying out of Meigs Field in Chicago, which was a private airport. If you look it up, you'll see where everyone who had money, the who's who of the Midwest, would fly into Meigs Field. And I remember Lance flying to Nebraska, meeting young runaway boys, or they would go to different organizations where foster kids were, where like gay organizations that they had in Nebraska and Iowa, where underage boys would go to. And they would actually bring those boys to Chicago. And it's odd because Harold Simon had a very large mansion in the suburbs, and he had a beautiful penthouse in Chicago. And I remember going to his house in the suburbs, which was in Lake Forest, and he probably had at least 50 young boys. And I had later on said, why does Hal Simon have so many young boys living at his home? And they always said that he was a foster parent, and that that's one of the reasons why he had so many young underage boys there.
Do you remember the specific years?
This was all between, from 79 through 85.
1979 to 1985.
And then I sort of lost, even though I would communicate with a lot of the members of the crew by phone, when I moved to Philadelphia, I lost contact with a lot of them. And I cut all of those memories off and moved on.
Mm-hmm. Sasha's recollection with Leslie Wexner, Sasha doesn't remember a lot about any interactions, but he remembers that his dad, William Kyle Riley, reported in some capacity to Leslie Wexner, and that there was confusion regarding Leslie Wexner and Les Lee sometimes with Mary Lynn, that Mary Lynn was sometimes confused about whether William Kyle was talking about Leslie Wexner or Leslie. But that's the extent of what Sasha at this time remembers. Now,
yes.
During those years, I'll send you some photos of William Kyle, and I'd like you to look at those photos, and we'll have some discussion about protocol and see if you have any memory of seeing William Kyle amongst the pilots at Makesfield.
Okay, definitely. If I remember, I'm sure that if I look at photos, I might be able to remember them.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that was interesting is the number of underage boys that they would bring to the Bijou Theater. And if anyone researches the theater, it was almost like a sex shop, where they had studios in the back, and they would actually make pornography and child pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And they published a lot of magazines, and the magazines would be shipped to the bookstores and sex shops throughout the United States. They may have been shipped out of the country as well, but I just remember them always talking about how the magazines and recordings, the videos, would be distributed throughout the United States. And that's one of the reasons why I was scared, because I did allow them to take nude photographs of me when I was young. And I was always worried that my parents might see them. And they would always tell me that, oh, no, we try to not circulate your magazines in Chicago. Don't worry about it. They're not going to find out.
Now, with the Bijou Theater, again, Bijou.
Yeah, and it's a place where I didn't even know this, but a couple of journalists had brought it to my attention. It was right by another club called the Carol's Speakeasy. And Carol's was next to, on the same block as the Bijou. And they had mentioned that John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer would actually go there to pick people up. And I don't know if this is true, but when I Googled one of the clubs, it states that Jeffrey Dahmer had met one of his victims at one of those clubs. And all of the clubs were actually funded by Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer. They were always investing in everything gay in Chicago. And I had mentioned to you this in the past that a guy by the name of Chuck Renslow was their best friend. And he was the front for everything. He was always meeting with Leslie, always meeting with Alan nonstop, at least once a week. Whenever Leslie was in town, but he met with Alan Kramer once a week.
Yeah. With the speakeasy carols.
Yes.
And the Bijou Theater, the mentions with John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, do you mean that during those years you recall them talking about Jeffrey Dahmer?
No.
Or was later on, you mean?
After they were arrested.
Yeah.
Not Jeffrey Dahmer, but after, John Wayne Gacy was arrested. I remember them talking about how they knew John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy had come to Alan Kramer's apartment at one point. And the Flight Bar, anyone can do their research, was kitty corner from Marina City. And Alan and Leslie would walk there. It was less than a block away. And that was like the hub of everything in the area where Leslie and Alan lived at the time. And the Flight Bar, then they changed the name to the New Flight, and you can read about it. I think I had sent you something in the past too.
Yeah.
Where there were people that had gotten killed. There were a lot of the hustlers and prostitutes, which I don't like to use the term that much. I mean, as far as prostitutes and hustlers, but they were actually underage boys that were mainly between no older than 15 that a lot of them wanted. But it was a bar that even older males hustled at. But the bar allowed underage boys as well. So John Wayne Gacy would actually go there and pick up underage boys.
Do you ever remember Gacy attending any of the parties?
I don't remember. And another thing too, and I was young, they drugged us mainly with, when they gave us a lot of Librium, we were like kind of numb. But then, I remember them giving me Librium. I mean, they may have given me Librium like when David met me at first, when he offered me the soda. There may have been Librium in the soda. And that's why I was so tired when he wanted me to leave the apartment that afternoon when I first met him. But as far as us being drugged, we were drugged, and when I look back, especially with the Quaaludes, and then a lot of them were using cocaine, especially at the mafia parties. They were always passing cocaine around. But I remember having times where I would have blackouts from the drugs that they were giving me. And then I was around 13, 14, and I would actually come out and say, oh, could I get a Librium? Could I get a Librium? Because it just became so natural, because Alan and Leslie were popping Librium like candy. So I felt that taking a Librium was okay eventually. And then with them giving the drugs out and then sneaking the drugs in drinks, which was common, I mean, I've witnessed that on multiple occasions. And then it became a joke, like I had mentioned in the past, with the drugging of the employees to sell more dresses and clothes and coats at the clothing stores that they owned. It was like a joke. Like, let's see how many fur coats they sell today. We'll put a little bit of... There was a name of a speed that they had back then. And Alan would always talk about the speed. And he could actually get the speed from his doctors. And they had doctors always around. That was just common to have doctors around them at all times.
And it was mostly, you said, the Librium, kinds of speed, cocaine.
Speed, I forgot the name of the speed, because a lot of the speed, they would just call the speed diet pills. They would use cocaine. they would use lithium and Quaaludes. Now, David Gailey was addicted to Quaaludes, and this was another incident that had happened. And what was interesting, when they wanted to get me out of the way, they would have an older man pick me up, whomever it was, one of their friends, and and I don't want to just focus on one group of people, but all of their friends were mainly Jewish that they would send us to. And I remember when they wanted to get me out of the way at times, they would have me go and stay with one of their friends. And I remember one time, they didn't know that I was going to be arriving. And I remember Alan opening up one of the doors at his apartment, and there was blood everywhere. And he told me that I had to leave. And I just remember he had blood even all over his hands. And then eventually he told me that someone had tried committing suicide in the apartment because they were on Quaaludes. He would always blame everything on drugs whenever there was a major incident as far as any type of blood involved.
Do you recall seeing anyone there with Alan?
I remember him opening up the door because there was like a peephole and cameras and everything. Mm-hmm. And he knew that it was me, and he told me that I had to leave, and he would not let me in at all. He told me I had to leave, come back later.
Do you remember what year that might have been?
I would say in 81, maybe 82. And then it got to the point where, I became numb to seeing the blood. And the reason why I say that is because whenever we would go to a mafia party, or if I would attend and go there and not participate, there was always blood. And I just remember they wanted black people to work at the parties. And the reason why they wanted all black guys, gay black guys, to work at the parties as far as cleaning up everything is because they knew that they were the help. And Alan and Leslie would joke around about getting Schwarzes to work Bill Pecklow's party or Holland's party that night, and then they would pay them because there was so much that had to be cleaned up, because they would urinate on boys. And these were parties that the young boys attended. There were mafia parties that older men attended too, but they kept everything separate because the older men that were not into young underage boys would make fun of Leslie and Alan because they were interested in underage boys, and they didn't really want to go to the same party.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a name for the guys, and I forgot the name. Lance used to always call them that. But Lance was also interested in young boys up until the age of 15. And once I turned 15, Lance and I became kind of like friends for a few years. And I would call Lance from Philadelphia when I was with John. But Lance was also a total, someone that was interested in anyone under 15. When I turned 15, I was too old.
At
and
15.
I just remember at the parties, the mafia parties, the black guys, because a lot of the parties were dark, they had different lights, they were absolutely scary, and they would have to clean up blood. They would have to clean up human feces. They would have to clean up the urine all over. Because I remember when a boy was sitting in the bathtub and they were being urinated on, and they wanted to stick they would stick these enema things up the boy's butt, and there would be human feces all in the bathtub, which had to be cleaned up because it wouldn't always go down the drain. And there was a lot of blood because when the boys were drugged on Librium, which I didn't realize this. Like I told you, I think it was one of the podcasters and then another journalist had mentioned that the Librium is like a muscle relaxer. So with the Librium and them giving Librium to the underage boys, they were able to get more fingers in their rectum, which is why they were bleeding so much. And I don't want to just say that it was just the boys because I was one of their victims too, but I don't like to go into detail about what they did to me.
With the boys that you saw and the blood, would you describe most of the blood from anal bleeding, from anal assault?
Because it happened to me. I mean, it's like I remember, like for instance, a couple of days after they did it to me, I was still bleeding and I would put toilet paper to kind of like prevent the blood from getting on my underwear. Because they would like really like penetrate me with their fingers. And another thing too, which was odd when I look back, they pretended and would joke around as if their fingers were their penises. They would prefer to use their fingers and fists more so than their penis.
Why do you think that is? Was there discussions of? Did Alan ever talk to you about?
And it's not okay. Like Alan was big as far as his size, but Leslie was small. But Alan was big, and even though he was big, he still like looked at his fingers as if the fingers and the fist and the hand was their dick, their penis. I'll call it penis, dick, whatever. But they looked at their hand, and I remember it was so strange because I had mentioned this in a tweet, and I had mentioned this in the past to different people, and they didn't believe me. But then later on, when everything started coming out, and it was like documented in police reports in LA, it talks about them cutting their nails short. Well, it was odd because whenever I would see them cut their nails, I knew that there was a party that evening or the following day because they always wanted their nails cut very, very short because of the cutting the internal organs like the rectum of the boy. So they would flick their hands up in the air and then joke around about how that fist and those fingers would be up a boy's butt, rectum.
Did you witness them torture the boys besides the sexual assault?
Well, okay. As far as I was concerned, when I look back on it all, I believe that handcuffing them to the sling and handcuffing their like legs to the sling, like their feet, because they would use handcuffs around the ankle and around their wrists and handcuff them to the slings. That was very big. And to me, when I look back, that is a form of torture because if you're handcuffed in the sling and they're doing this to a young boy, that's a form of torture. And even when I was handcuffed and I look back at me being in that sling handcuffed, that was a form of torture. And then, as far as Carol's Speakeasy, there was a drag queen, and recently someone had did a story about different clubs in Chicago. And they had a picture of a drag queen that worked at Carol's Speakeasy, and her name was Regina. And Mrs. Florsheim and Bella Wexner did her makeup for a fashion show that they had of all drag queens at one of the bars in Chicago. But Regina was so proud when she would come over to Alan's home to let everyone know her boy was at home in the bedroom, handcuffed to the sling. And then one time we did go to Regina's house, which was in Chicago, and what was our apartment? We walked in, and in the bedroom, you know, one of those pulleys that they have for taking motors out of cars?
Yes.
Okay, it was like a loft-style apartment on the north side of Chicago, and she was so excited to show her boy that was up in the sling, hanging from the ceiling in a sling with handcuffs on, and they used the pulley to pull the sling up to the ceiling. And that was Regina, one of their friends that worked in the back at Carol's Speakeasy. And we were able to go into the bars as long as we were with Leslie or Alan or Lance. Even though we were 13, 14, they would just walk right in there with us. So I just remember Regina, and then when I saw the picture of Regina, it brought back a lot of memories of Regina.
Mm-hmm. Well, and certainly the handcuffing is a type of torture.
Yes, but yet what they did, even though they were evil, and definitely had serious mental issues, they tried to mainstream it at the time that everyone in the gay community was doing that. And if anyone researches Chicago during the 70s and early 80s, they will see that it was like a leather torture city. And you had blocks of sex shops, leather shops. So they tried to normalize it during the 70s and early 80s. So even though they were torturing the young boys, they kind of tried normalizing it, like as if that was just one side of them. And they would like look at the entire mafia party, or when they were going to other sex parties, as if it was like theater. They would like get all leather. Some of them would wear all leather. I remember one guy, Peter, was so excited to bring a whip because they would whip the underage boys. And he would have his whip hanging on the side, and he would wear assless chaps. And he was another one that only liked underage boys. And he was obsessed with Asian boys too. And he would use his whip. And Peter was an absolute sicko. And he was another one at the parties that would actually defecate all over. And I just will never forget him running around naked, totally hairy. And some of them looked so bizarre because they would even wear like a leather vest and be totally naked and no shirt on, just a leather vest. And it was just so sick when I look back on it all.
Yes.
And I mean, they tried to normalize. Oh, and the point that I was trying to get at, it was as if they had multiple personalities. Once they went into the mafia party or went to a violent sex party, they became another person. And then you would see them the following day, and they would pretend that everything that happened the night before or the day before did not even happen. They didn't want to talk about it. And then at times, they went through a phase where they wanted to take you shopping, where they wanted to buy you clothes, where they wanted to treat you as you were their son. And a lot of times, they wanted you to call them daddy. And when I look back, when I think of how they all wanted us to call them daddy, they really got off on us calling them daddy. But that was just like another phase that they were going through. And then by them being so nice and taking you to dinner and taking you clothes shopping and going to Six Flags, like as if you were actually their son. I remember they liked going to arcades. They liked going to different amusement parks.
Mm-hmm.
And they would take us to amusement parks. So that was just one side of them. That was the nice side of them. And then they would snap when they would get into this violent sexual act at the mafia party or at these sex parties, or even just like a one-on-one sexual encounter. So that was I think they went into a different, they became a different person.
When you watch the Holocaust movies, what do you recall of a pattern of,
Yes.
how often were you
Okay.
told to watch them? Were you coerced to watch them? Were you?
Yes.
What was
we
the
had to
presentation?
sit, and like I had mentioned in the past, you have to realize that, when you were around the group, I call it the crew, but they called themselves the Jew crew. They would say the Jew crew. And Alan was very, among the Jewish guys, they would call each other kike and everything, but no one else could call them that. So when we were with the crew, at times they didn't want me around, and that's when they would send me somewhere else. So what went on during that period when they would send me to other homes or apartments, I have no idea what was going on. But with the Holocaust movies, they would have 3 to 4, 5 boys, I shouldn't say guys, young boys, and they were proud to as if they were teaching us something at first. Mm-hmm. And then while they would play, I just remember there were multiple black and white Holocaust movies that they played originally. And then I just remember later on, a year later, they had colored Holocaust movies that they played, recent Holocaust movies back in the early 80s. And they would sit there as they were playing the shows and the movies, and they would just talk about how horrible Goyim were. They would talk about how horrible our parents were because they were Goyim, and we should be glad that we're with Jews, which meant they were Jewish. You should be glad that, I remember Alan always saying that I should be honored that he has accepted me into their little crew. They would frequently say things like that, and they would sit there and just talk about everything that the Jews went through, and it was all of our faults because we were non-Jewish and we did that to them. And they would verbalize that all the time. And then I remember playing for time. I remember one day he playing for time because I would stay in the house all day with them. And I remember him playing for time all day, non-stop. And they had beta tapes and VHS tapes. And it was non-stop all day, just leaving that one movie on. And I remember one of the movies, I'm not sure which one it was a piano player in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And they were playing amazing piano music. And I remember Alan was talking about how, and so was Leslie, how they tricked people to make them believe that they were going into some kind of another place other than the concentration camp. And then, it was just bizarre. And now when I look back on that episode, I think they were probably just trying to belittle us and make us look guilty as if we were doing something to them, but yet at the same time they wanted us to look up to them and feel sorry for them.
So it was usually, you said, up to 5 boys that were watching the movies.
And you have to realize that this is as far as the movies, it was only like, that's what I've witnessed, but this went on with others also. I mean, I remember one kid, Jesse, and he was from he was from a family that I don't know what religion they were, but he didn't know anything about Jews at all. But I remember Jesse talking about, oh, so did he run you through all the movies yet? And I had acknowledged, yes, we saw those movies. So Jesse was never there when I watched the movies. So this was probably something that they did frequently.
And you said there were several different apartments in the building.
Yes. Alan had his main apartment, and then he had multiple studios in the building that people would stay at. And then he had a home in the suburbs, and he had another apartment on Astor Place. And they would actually leave the apartment and go down to other, I mean, I did too, to other studios in the building to have sex.
With the Bijou Theater,
Yes.
you said there was rooms in the back, there was filming.
Yes.
What do you recall? Do you ever recall any discussion of torture films or snuff films? What?
Okay, at the time, Alan would watch them. He would get videos from the Bijou and from other sources I don't know. Somewhere in Michigan, he would always say. And Alan and Leslie would sit there and watch the films nonstop. And yes, they would watch violent films where people were being killed. And they just said that they were films. And I remember at one point, yes, they watched films where individuals were getting killed, kids were getting killed, but at the time, I just assumed that they were all actors and it was all fake. I didn't look at it as if it was real. I just assumed that it was fake. And it was all acting.
How often do you recall them watching films, and how often did you watch?
Listen to this. You're not going to believe this, and I know that someone can do their research. Lance Durfee was paid by the Bijou Theater to watch films. And I know that when Lance died, and he died, I don't think he died that long ago. I know that his family had to go through all the films. Lance had thousands and thousands of films. I remember Lance saying at the time he had over 40,000 films. He had rooms of nothing but pornography and child pornography. Okay? And he had so much, and it was unbelievable. And he would watch these films nonstop. But I remember, the last time he did something to me, I was approximately 14. And while he was doing something to me on the floor, he was watching movies of kids. So Lance was hired just to review the films before they started marketing them and distributing them nationally. And I mean, even later on, I actually flew to Chicago from Philadelphia. And I'll never forget, he invited me over for dinner. And I would say under 18 at the time. And he just wanted to show his library of films. He was so impressed by having so many films.
I'm just scribbling some notes about when Lance died, and the state of the film collection.
And Lance, though, everyone would call him a vicious queen, because even Alan and Leslie, because Lance was always calling the police. He was always turning people in. Lance had disappeared to LA. He lived in New York for a while. Then he disappeared to LA. And he went to LA to have plastic surgery also while he was living there. He came back to Chicago, and that's when he was brought back into the scene. And the first thing, I'll never forget Leslie warning me about Lance, and Alan even warning me about Lance, that he could not be trusted. But what's really odd when I look back at Lance, and I have no idea how he made his money. Lance had a jewelry collection that was worth millions of dollars. But yet, everyone said that he was a hairstylist to the celebrities. But he was always taking me to jewelers and having unbelievable pieces of jewelry melted down and remade into rings and other pieces of jewelry for himself. When I look back on that, I'm thinking to myself, and I have no proof, that maybe he was stealing the jewels from maybe, I mean, I'd hate to say this about him, maybe from the wealthy individuals that he was doing hair for? Because he dealt with everyone as far as the Pritzkers doing the ladies' hair. Mrs. Florsheim's. He did Bella Wexner's hair at one point when she was in Chicago. He did whoever was who's who, majority of them were Jewish ladies, he did their hair, and they paid him very well. But then, out of nowhere, he would pop up with like a $200,000 worth of piece of jewelry and take it in and get it melted down and made into rings and necklaces or bracelets, whatever he wanted. So that was just a thought that came to my mind later on, but I had no proof. But why was he melting down the jewelry and just making a ring out of it? And he would show me and I went with him on multiple occasions to his jeweler, and I even remember where the jeweler was. It was at 17 North State Street in Chicago, and the jeweler would make his jewelry for him.
North State Street. With the
Yes.
jewelry, you recall, no, because, there's cases where individuals have melted down jewelry to try to sell for the value of the gold or the silver, the stones.
He would never sell it. He would melt
So it was more
down
trophyized. Like he had jewelry that he wanted transformed to a ring or something.
Yes. He always had it transformed into a ring or bracelet. And then after it was done, he would show everyone, and he would he had bright blue eyes, and he would blink his eyes. And we always called him a chandelier queen. Just like the other ones that were into antiques. They were all into antiques. I mean, even Leslie Wexner's interior designer's daughter-in-law, she said that all they wanted to do was go to antique shows and go to antique dealers in Paris. She flew with them, and they were obsessed with antiques. But Lance he would just have the jewels melted down and remade, but he would never sell any of it. And then he had all of his jewelry on display at his apartments. And then I remember there was a drag queen,
like trophies.
Like trophies, just like Alan Kramer had the mummies lined up. I mean, we're talking probably 10 different mummies. It was all like a trophy. And then Alan Kramer had all the Egyptian jewelry, which he collected at the time, in display cases. Lance had all of his jewelry in display cases at his apartment.
And Lance never talked at all about where the jewelry had come from.
No. No, he would just say he had gotten it out of the safe. And he'd blink his eyes real quickly. He'd like bat his eyes.
He'd say he'd gotten from it, retrieved from a safe, bat his eyes.
Yes, he would come out and say, I went into the safe. I went to the safe to deposit box and got a few jewels. I'm going to have them because everything is outdated. I'm taking it to the jeweler. Come on with me. And I would go with him. And he would have everything melted down and remade into rings, bracelets, or necklaces for himself.
And he never talked about where the jewelry came from other than a safe.
He would always say, out of a safe.
Did he ever talk about his background?
The only thing that I knew about Lance is that he was a hairdresser, a makeup artist, and he was from Iowa. But yet he would travel to Iowa because Alan said that he knew all about Iowa, and he would go to Nebraska and he would meet younger boys at runaway centers and bring them to Chicago and gay centers.